Well, good morning. I'm David Penn, Managing Director of Conquest, and I'm going to be talking to you this morning about should we be neuromantics or neuroskeptics. Now, specifically what I'm going to be talking about really are these four questions or four issues. Firstly, I want to talk about why I believe that neuroscience is not the same thing as neuromarketing, and often people believe that these two things are synonymous. Second thing, and I think it's probably the most important for me, is that we mustn't forget the science in neuroscience. If we do, there's not a lot of point. And I think, again, there's a tendency to forget the scientific element of neuroscience. Which brings me to the issue of case studies. There are very few published case studies in the public domain, and there's a reason for that, and we're going to come and talk about that. And finally, we're going to come back to this issue of should we be neuromantics or neuroskeptics, and why I think the jury's out. Okay, so why the interest in neuroscience? Well, anybody who's been to a conference, marketing research conference in the last 10 years or so, must have heard someone say something along the lines of the neuroscience has revolutionized our understanding of how the consumer makes decisions. And probably you've heard someone say something like, we've learned more about the brain in the last 10, 15, 20 years than we did in the previous 100,000, billion, whatever. And a lot of that is true. And I think it's come head-to-head with another frustration, which I think most researchers have felt for a long time, a frustration with the limitations of conventional market research techniques. And I personally feel this. And I think particularly so for the measurement of emotion. I think both in the qualitative and the quantitative domain, people feel frustrated with the limitations of those techniques. Now, I'm just going to start by defining a few terms. Neuroscience, strictly speaking, is the scientific study of the nervous system, very, very big topic. Generally what we're talking about in the context of a presentation like this is what's called cognitive neuroscience. And cognitive neuroscience is the study of how thoughts and feelings are implemented in the brain, or into the brain, which is distinct from neuromarketing, or what's sometimes called neurometrics. And neuromarketing is the use of neuroscientific technologies to measure response to marketing stimuli. And I'll come on to talk about those, but we're talking about fMRI, EEG, eye tracking, and so on. And just so you don't miss the point, neuromarketing is not the same as neuroscience. So what does cognitive neuroscience tell us? Well, what has it ever done for us? I think probably what's quite important is to make clear that neuroscience has not completely revolutionized the way we think about human behavior. I mean, we've known for quite a while from modern cognitive psychology that some decisions are made intuitively, automatically, and without any conscious control or effort. So we've known about what have been called implicit processes for quite some time. But what neuroscience has brought to the party is that it's shown that conscious decisions often seem to be based on emotional rather than rational cues, or triggered subconsciously. It's shown us that a large proportion of human motivations actually lie below the level of consciousness. And it's also shown, most importantly, that emotions cannot be measured adequately via self-report verbal indicators. And as a consequence of that, marketers are seeking new ways to explore preconscious, non-verbal stages of information processing, even though in reality we know very little about the way the brain processes marketing stimuli. Sorry, just waiting for the page to advance. Right, well, no good neuroscience presentation is complete without this image of an iceberg. And it's an effective metaphor because essentially what it's telling us is that 90 or 95% or so of our thinking and our decision-making is actually made unconsciously. It's based on emotions, it's largely non-verbal, and the other 10, 15% or so is actually the conscious, rational, verbal bit. The bit that we know about is one way of putting it. Now, this is a vast oversimplification, but it's quite an effective one. And it's sometimes shorthanded as System 1 and System 2 thinking. I think it's okay, except that there is no such thing in the brain as System 1 or System 2. It is a lot more complicated than that. And unfortunately, we do have to look at things in a slightly more complex way to understand this. What neuroscience has done, though, undoubtedly, is to challenge our existing consumer models. Again, a bit of an oversimplification, but I guess, going back 20, 30 years, we used to think of the consumer very much in terms of someone who weighs up the benefits of the options on offer, choosing the best one. We've moved to a model which is much more in terms of one which says that we're in control, or we're not in control of, or even aware of most of our reasoning, which is influenced by our emotional response. We used to think that we could explain our behavior, our thinking, and our emotions. We now believe that we have a vast and automatically operating unconscious mind, and we have no direct conscious access to it. So these are pretty fundamental changes. And a couple of quotes here from two neuroscientists. Antonio Damasio, a very famous guy, who tells us that whenever emotions conflict with thinking, emotion wins. And a wonderful metaphor here, that we're about as effective at stopping an emotion as stopping a sneeze, which captures perfectly the involuntary nature of emotion, that we can't control its effect on us. And Donald Carl, who tells us that emotion leads to action while reason leads to conclusions, indicating that what reason tends to lead us to is post-rationalization. So when we look at this in the context of market research, emotion is all about stuff that happens in the brain. We become aware of emotion through our feelings, how it makes us feel. And we can explain those feelings back to a third party, psychoanalyst or a market research interviewer even. But essentially that's a process of rationalization. And the point is that conventional market research operates pretty much at this on the right-hand side of the chart here, in the area of stated feelings and post-rationalization. And again, another cliche, but cliches tend to be true. Conventional research is much better at measuring the head than it is at measuring the heart. And there's a very simple reason for that. That most market research, conventional market research, uses questions. The way that we ask questions is through words. If we use words, if we use language, and particularly if we use quite complicated scales, it makes us think, it makes us consider. And the point is that the more we think, the more we consider, the further we get from that involuntary response that we call emotion. And this leads us to another problem or another issue, that how do we actually understand the meaning of emotion without asking a question? A slightly obscure looking quote here, but a very important one from Fred Marston and Gerald Zeltman, who tell us that emotion without cognitive appraisal is really just arousal. Now what do they mean by that? Essentially what they're saying is that emotion is a physiological response. If we only look at the physiological response, all we're measuring is arousal. What we want to know is whether that emotion is positive or negative. In other words, what is its valence? And what kind of emotion is it? Because if we don't know that, it's not a whole lot of use to us. So how do we get around this problem, that emotion without cognitive appraisal is really just arousal? And can we understand emotion essentially without asking people how they feel? And this is really what neuromarketing is supposed to do. It really came in to address this fundamental dilemma of how we measure emotion without asking people a question. Something we've been trying to do for centuries. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with phrenology, feeling people's bumps on their scalp to try and discern through these bumps how people feel actually inside their brain. And nowadays, with the advent of fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, we can actually, metaphorically look into the brain and actually see what's going on, take images, and what we discover when we do that is that consumers don't always tell us the truth about why they buy brands. Now, fMRI is one of a suite of neuromarketing techniques. What fMRI does is essentially it measures increased oxygen levels in blood flows within the brain. So when a part of the brain activates, essentially blood flows towards it, the oxygen level rises, and fMRI picks that up. It's not the only way of conducting neuromarketing. There's also EEG, which has become increasingly popular. What EEG does is captures minute electrical signals produced by the brain. And there's also what are called biometrics, and these are things like eye tracking, tracking eye movement, galvanic skin response. And you'll notice I've labeled these primary and secondary, and that's not to give them a sort of order of precedence, as it were. But the point about fMRI and EEG and what's different about them is that these are techniques which directly measure brain response. Biometrics are essentially secondary measures because they measure the results of brain response. They don't directly measure brain response itself, and that's quite important, as we'll come on to see. Now, I want to take you back to the birth of neuromarketing in 2003, when neuroscientists in the US did a blind product test of Coke and Pepsi, and at the same time put people through fMRI. What they found was that in this blind product test, only the parts of the brain relating to sensory judgment were active when people were doing the blind test. When respondents were told what they were drinking, a couple of things happened. Firstly, their stated preference switched in Coke's favor. But most importantly for us, parts of the brain associated with emotional response became active. And what the brain imaging, or fMRI, showed us was that Coke branding activated areas of the brain associated with emotional judgment, whilst knowledge of Pepsi didn't have the same effect. Now, I've been working on colas for quite a number of years, and I did a lot of work with Pepsi on the Pepsi Challenge, which, as you probably know, is essentially a blind test where you get people to try the two colas, state their preference, and then afterwards they're told which one they've chosen. And what happens in that test is overwhelmingly Pepsi is preferred by around about 55%, but we know that in the marketplace, Coke generally is preferred to Pepsi. Now, that's the observed phenomenon. Until I saw this test, nobody was really able to properly understand what was going on in the brain. So this was pretty fundamental, that actually what this test demonstrated was that there was a genuine and demonstrable brain event or activity that correlated with people's preference for these two brands, and it was to do with how their emotions were implemented in their brain. So pretty fundamental stuff. Which I guess leads me to ask why fMRI as a technique isn't used more widely, because it's not. And it is, after all, the only neuromarketing technique with sufficiently high spatial resolution, as the jargon goes, to locate activity in specific brain regions. The problem with it is, firstly, it's hugely expensive. The equipment is non-portable. I mean, it basically has to stay in a fixed spot. It also has quite poor temporal resolution. The reason for that is that it can take about 5 seconds for the added blood supply to reach an activated or affected part of the brain, which ain't too good if you're trying to measure something like fast-moving images in a TV ad. It's also, as you can probably see from this picture, quite a claustrophobic and stressful respondent experience. Some people are fine in it, some people do freak out in this. So, perhaps not ideal from a market research point of view. So how about biometrics? We talked about them. Well, eye tracking, again, something very commonly used. Its advocates normally quote the strong eye hypothesis, which says that a person cognitively processes information at the same time and for as long as their visual attention is fixed on that object. The skin conductance, which can measure the degree of arousal created by a stimulus. There's facial EMG, which measures voluntary and involuntary facial muscle movements, which may reflect conscious or unconscious expressions of emotion. So all of these are techniques which can measure some degree of arousal. Question is, can these techniques tell us the emotional meaning of the response? Can they actually tell us the emotional valence of the response that they're measuring? And there's a bit of a disagreement here and quite a lot of issues. I mean, quite a lot of competing evidence. And I'm trying to give you the best summary I can here. But there's no full agreement about the impact of emotional valence on visual attention. And most evidence shows that both negative and positive things capture our attention, which sort of coincides with common sense as well. Pupil dilation, sometimes put forward as a way of evaluating affected states, not a very consistent indicator, unfortunately. And skin conductance can certainly help us determine whether someone has been aroused by a particular stimulus. It's not that helpful for telling us about valence, about the meaning of the emotion that we're observing. So is there anything else that can help us here? And that's really what brings us to EEG. Now, EEG relies on a model that was put forward by neuroscientists called Davidson a long time ago, actually, 1979. And what he told us was that the left prefrontal cortex even is generally involved in approach behavior, while the right prefrontal cortex is generally involved in withdrawal from aversive stimuli. So what we can say is that greater left prefrontal cortex activity associated with positive affect, the greater right PSC implies processing of negative affect. Now, the evidence is pretty compelling for this. Unfortunately, not completely conclusive, however, because anger, which is an approach but a negatively valenced emotion, can't always be separated from happiness. So we may be experiencing approach behavior either because we want to go and beat someone up or because we want to go and hug them. Now, I'm being slightly facetious there, but that's the problem in terms of interpreting this. So it's not always as simple as it looks. And the brain is not always as simple as it looks. Now, I've tried to simplify this to make this as easy as possible. But essentially, what I try to show in this diagram are the bits of the brain that are associated with conscious reasoning and the bits of the brain that are mainly associated with emotional processing. We've got the prefrontal cortex and we've got the limbic system. Now, the point is about the prefrontal cortex, it's a bit of the brain that we believe probably corresponds to the executive function. It's a bit of the brain where we think and reason and make our decisions. But there are two quite distinct bits to it. There's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the orbital prefrontal cortex. The orbital prefrontal cortex is the bit that basically attaches emotional value to the things that we see. And that works in tandem with the rest of the limbic system, pretty much unconsciously. And Davidson has written comparatively recently that one unwitting consequence of my work is the view that the prefrontal cortex is the primary region for emotion and motivation. Yet the prefrontal sector, which is most directly associated with emotion, is actually the orbital prefrontal cortex. Problem is, this is the sector least likely to be recorded by EEG. So to cut a long story short, the bit of the brain that we're most interested in actually doesn't show up very well in EEG measurement. And this is quite a fundamental problem. And it's why EEG must be treated with caution, because the bit of the brain that we pick up most easily is this bit called the dorsolateral. And that's the bit most associated with cognitive control. Emotion and motivation are part of very complicated circuitry. Instantiated is the neuroscientist's favorite term, but instantiated involving various bits of the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the hippocampus. And the problem is that the parts of the prefrontal cortex that contribute most to electrical signals picked up by EEG actually represent only a small part of this. So EEG is not a perfect solution. There are a lot of issues scientifically with its use. What about conventional marker research? Is there something we can do with this? And I want to talk about a few new techniques which have surfaced. A couple here which actually, strictly speaking, haven't derived from neuroscience, but are more derived from social psychology. Firstly, facial coding, largely based on the work of Paul Ekman. And the rationale here is very simple, that facial expressions are linked directly to emotions and are universal. And the application is twofold. Firstly, there's facial decoding, which is basically getting an expert on facial expressions to decode the facial expressions of people watching, for example, a commercial. The second one is using what are called proxies, which in simple terms means showing people faces and asking them to choose the face which corresponds most closely to the emotion that they feel. There's quite a lot of debate between these two, the proponents of these two methodologies in terms of which is the best and most genuine measure of emotion. I'm not going to get into that, but just to say that both of them I think have their merits, but there probably isn't enough published information at this stage to come down categorically one side or the other. Also, implicit association tests, which have been around quite a long time in social psychology. They were actually developed initially to detect what's called implicit bias, and they were used in areas like to detect racism. So, the issue being that someone may have an implicit bias against certain races, which doesn't show up in explicit interviewing. So what they say actually doesn't correspond with what they actually believe. And these tests seem to find out whether people were actually unconsciously influenced by prejudices. And essentially the way they do that is that it's by measuring speed of association with words, often with some kind of pre-priming. Now again, the evidence is that they certainly do get you different results from explicit or conventional market research. But there is some controversy again about their validity particularly in terms of repeatability. Some of you also might have read Gladwell's comment that, for example, if you visualize Nelson Mandela while you take one of these implicit association tests, that you may actually be able to disguise the fact that you are a racist. So again, some controversy, but I think some useful applications. Sorry, just waiting for the chart. Now, just coming back to emotions. We've had emotions a long time in evolutionary terms, and we have had emotions a lot longer than we've had language. If you look at these cave drawings, the guys that drew these had emotions, but they couldn't actually write how they felt. But they could show us how they felt. They could depict excitement. And Gerald Zeltman, business professor in the U.S., has written a lot about nonverbal aspects of emotion. And he's said here that by engaging the language of visual imagery, we enable a richer description of our inner feelings. Which brings me to metaphor, and I have to declare an interest here because this is something which, as a company, we have worked with and developed. And it comes from a discipline which is a branch of neuroscience called cognitive linguistics. And the rationale is essentially that metaphors are universal. And what they are universal thought constructs which underpin language and which link directly to our emotions. The application of them can be quantitative, that you can construct metaphoric scales visually, which get round the problem of language, but essentially illustrate different metaphorical constructs. So a simple one is, for example, affection is warmth. We talk about people having a warm personality, people being very cold, which is a metaphor for affection. And this can be illustrated visually. Or it can be done qualitatively via deconstruction of images to find the underlying metaphors that underpin how people feel. And last but not least, this is something I haven't got a name for. I'll call it output analysis, and it's based on probably the most interesting book I've read in the last couple of years by a neuroscientist called Semir Zeki. It's called Splendors and Miseries of the Brain. Fantastic title. Essentially what he argues is that through looking at art, literature, even opera, what we can see is the evidence of underlying inherited brain concepts, which we can deconstruct and deconstruct them to understand the brain concepts that underlie them and motivate them in essence. And he looks at opera like Tristan and Isolde, he looks at Cézanne, he looks at Dante, so quite a tour de force. I don't think anyone's come up with an application for this, but I chuck it in simply because I think it's interesting. And last but not least, I just want to touch very briefly on something that's quite new, and I suspect that Mark Earls might talk about this, the social brain. This builds on work by a number of social neuroscientists, but probably one of the most famous discoveries is mirror neurons. A guy called Giacomo Rizzolotti in Italy was brain scanning using EEG on a monkey, and one of his assistants went out, got himself an ice cream, came back in, monkey saw the guy eating the ice cream, and the brain trace went crazy. Now essentially what this indicated was that there was a neuronal firing going on in the monkey's brain, empathetically, in response to what the monkey was seeing, which kind of chimes with common sense because, there's a cliche about, if you laugh, the world laughs with you, but we do feel other people's pain. We feel other people's happiness. So the point is that when mirror neurons fire, it's a remarkable neural event, the formation between two brains with a functional link, with the output of one becoming input to drive the other. And I think this is a fascinating area and one very ripe for development. So coming back to the issue of should we be neuromantics or neuroskeptics, here's a neuromantic, A.K. Pradeep, the guy who set up Neurofocus in the US, who tells us that only EEG can provide direct measurement of neurological activity in the brain registered at the true speed of thought. Graham Page, Norwood Brown, this was probably about 2007, may have changed his views slightly since then, but he told us that the sorts of validation exercises which have been an essential part of the adoption of survey-based techniques have not been done for neuroscience-based methods. Survey-based work has a proven link to behavior. It may not tell the whole story, but to abandon it in favor of neuroscience would mean abandoning methods which have demonstrable meaning and insight. Another neuroskeptic view, marketers are not interested in science or complexity. They want simplicity, an easy to understand single number solution. There's a temptation to oversimplify and overclaim. Personally, I think this is the biggest single problem in the commercial application of neuroscience. People try to be too simple. And I know it's very tedious if someone spends half an hour of a presentation lecturing you on the structures of the brain, but unfortunately you do have to understand some of it to make sense of the stuff that comes out. You can't boil this stuff down to single metrics very easily. And, Pradeep himself admits that Neurofocus throw away more measurements than they actually use. There's a high level of interpretation that goes into using the outputs from neuromarketing. But finally, a real neuromantic here, Martin Lindstrom, who compares advertisers to Christopher Columbus gripping a single map of the earth he believed to be flat. Thanks to neuromarketing, we're now able to see an almost Aristotelian shift in thinking. Companies are beginning to realize that the world, in fact, is round. So he clearly believes that neuromarketing is the coming thing. So finally, what does the jury have to say on neuromarketing? Well, the arguments are pretty simple. Verbal responses about emotion are unreliable. Respondents tend to post-rationalize. Too much goes on unconsciously to rely on conscious response. We can't see into our own brains. It's not possible. So neuromarketing tells us what we can't know through other means. Against, it's difficult to locate specific emotions in the brain, except perhaps via fMRI. What most neuromarketing techniques is they either give us a partial view, like EEG, or a secondary or time-lagged recording, like biometrics. The fundamental problem is we can observe a brain response, we can see arousal, but that doesn't tell us about its valence or how it feels. The only way you can find out how an emotion feels is by asking someone a question. And we know little about the way the brain processes marketing stimuli. There haven't been enough academic studies done. And my final thoughts, a quote here from Richard Thorogood of Colgate-Palmolive. In neuromarketing, there is no M equals MC squared equation. And a couple of my own thoughts, and these are things, if I was setting an exam question on neuromarketing, I would probably ask my students to consider. Firstly, the science is good enough for experimentation rather than commercial application. So discuss that one. And lastly, this field has become commercialized too soon, with too many vested interests claiming that their technique is the answer, plus too little sharing of knowledge and genuine academic investigation. I'd like you to discuss that one as well. Okay, well, thanks very much for listening. And over now to questions and answers. Thank you.